And we are live, family. Peace and blessings. This is your brother asarimhotep with the Madhu Andela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. This is another edition with Conversations with Brother Asar. And we have a very, very special guest with us today, um, Dr. Shomarka Keita. And we are going to have a conversation on a wide variety of subject matter. And just want to give a little time for people coming in to, oh, hold on one second. I'm getting some feedback on this other computer. There we go. Okay, getting back to the forum here. So as normal, I like to give a shout out to everyone who is listening live, and especially those who are going to catch the archives. So thanks to everyone who is in the chat room, who's here early, to Astaroth and Infinite Solar Mass, 42 Tribes, Jarrell Amade, Brother Chavis, and others who are in the chat. Thank you for joining. And today is a special day. We know, I normally do my shows on the weekends and in the evenings, but this is a special daytime edition. So I know many of you may be at work. Most of you are probably in the house right now due to the quarantines. So shout out to Dr. Kaikosa Kajango, who's also in the chat. Greetings. Brother Alan Flagg, thank you for joining. Let me just make sure one little thing. Okay, so I got to be my own board here to do all the technical work. But as usual, I like to bring guests on who are specialists in their fields, who have done a large amount of work that help to enlighten and inform the public on various different, topics, ranging from history, culture, the sciences, technologies, and things of that nature. So this is someone whose work I have been reading for a number of years, and in recent times have gotten to know him personally, and have some conversations with him concerning history and research methodology and things of that nature. So I wanted to have those private type of conversations with the public, and to introduce to the lay public this scholar who many may not be aware of, who don't necessarily delve deep into historiography and paleontology and bioanthropologies and things of that nature. So we'll have, kind of a broad overview of his studies. And so before I even bring him on, let me give you a brief bio of him. Dr. Shomarka Keita is a biological anthropologist and a physician with interest in skeletal biology, the history of ideas about human variation, and race, in quotes, the persistence of racial thinking and colonialism in science, ancient African biology, early African history, biopiracy, the lack of African researchers in genetics, and the social determinants of health. He received his education at the Howard University College of Medicine, SUNY Binghamton, if I'm saying that correctly, and Oxford University. So without further ado, I welcome our special guest, Dr. Shomarka Keita. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm doing well.
All right. Before we get started, I know that you are in the medical field, and we're currently in a situation where this virus COVID 9 or 19, I forgot what it is. 19 is, taking a hold on the world right now. And so what has been your experience with it, dealing with it kind of on the front lines? Not necessarily, you as a like an immunologist, so to speak, but you being in teaching in the medical field, how has this impacted, what you do and what you see out there?
Well, I actually work as a medical officer in an old public hospital in Washington, D.C. And so I practice medicine. I don't teach medicine. I don't do research in medicine for the most part. And so, I have my own concerns because sometimes I go on units where we have to dress up in, personal protective equipment, the equipment that you've heard about, clothing from on TV the last couple of weeks or so. So I've actually had contact with people who've had this illness, this virus, and sometimes unknowingly in the earlier days when we didn't understand it, we didn't know it. So it's a great personal concern to me, and I do have to work with patients who have these issues. This illness, I should say. Yeah.
All right. And so based upon your experience and working at the hospitals, to reiterate, the best practices for us at this particular time, what should we be doing to reduce the risk of us, catching the virus?
Well, I would say be over safe. CDC, follow the CDC guidelines and add one, so to speak. So when the CDC, when it wasn't clear about the spread of this virus, when it wasn't clear that it could remain on surfaces, when it wasn't clear that just simply speaking could spread it, we probably all should have been super cautious. And some people were. They were wearing masks and what have you. Other people were listening to what the CDC said and moving in accordance with that. And that makes perfect sense. That's legitimate in terms of the way we view expertise. But I would say that I wish I had been overly cautious. I have small children. Anyone that's got a family, be overly cautious. And the point is that you don't have to believe anything specific about the origins of this virus. You just have to understand that it's more infectious than the regular flu and that it can kill you. That's all you need to understand. You don't need to understand anything else. And if that's the case, then you should protect your family, protect the community that you live in, and the community at large. Be respectful and do what's asked. It won't hurt you. It's better to have that attitude and not need it than to need it and wish that you had done it.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to Ivan for your contribution, and for all the new people who have come in the chat, Brother Sean, T'Challa, Dr. Vanessa Davies, who is this? Inyusera, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Fitzroy Roberts, Black Panther, and I Am King Sosa, and Safa Rabah Muhammad. Thank you all. And SC44, I think I've gotten everybody thus far. And so I'd like to acknowledge everyone who joins us live.
Excellent.
Thank you thank you all for joining us live.
And greetings to everyone. Please be safe. Please remember that the things we do are not only for ourselves personally, but for our communities and for the good of humanity in general.
Indeed. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit. And so given that it doesn't seem like you do too many of these live conversations. To give us a little bit of background about yourself. Where are you from? What got you interested in medicine, and then ultimately, how did you end up going from medicine into bioanthropology and dealing with African history from that perspective? So if you can kind of give us a timeline and insight into who you are.
Well, I was born in South Carolina, and so I'm a descendant of West Africans of different origins, Mande and others. And I grew up there in South Carolina, familiar with some of the interest in the old crops, things like rice and so forth. My grandfather talked about these things, not scholastically, but just in terms of things that he liked. And we moved from there when I was younger and to other places. But I found a book when I was, I guess, in 8th grade or so, by Daniel Chu and Elliot Skinner on West African history. And that's probably where my initial interest came from. And then I discovered the older editions of John Hope Franklin's book, From Slavery to Freedom, in which the initial chapters spoke about African history, both deep time and more recently. And at about that time, too, I discovered various books on anatomy. I think that Herbert Zinn's book on the heart really fascinated me. And so I learned something about the 4 chambers of the heart, and that was interesting. So that was the start of my interest in medicine. And then I went to Howard University Medical School after having done some years of undergrad school, both here and in Egypt. And at medical school, I met Montague Cobb, who was the first African American, perhaps, to have gotten a degree that was connected to a department that did biological anthropology. But he did his degree actually in the Department of Anatomy at Case Western. And what you have to understand is that what we call biological anthropology or physical anthropology has its root in several things, so-called natural history, as well as anatomy in medical school. So many of the people who were interested in skeletal remains, archaeological skeletal remains, what we would now call bioarchaeology, were anatomists or were people who had gone to medical school and then did a PhD in anatomy, or simply used their medical degree to further their interest in anatomy, such as and for that matter, evolutionary history. So someone like T.D. Stewart at the Smithsonian, who was there when I was in medical school, very kind man, an aristocrat. He'd gone to Harvard Medical School to satisfy, I believe, his parents, and finished early to help with the war effort in World War II. And when I first went to the Smithsonian, I worked with Larry Angel, but I could walk through the halls, and people like Donald Ortner and T.D. Stewart welcomed me into their labs. And T.D. Stewart was fond of showing me Neanderthal mandibles. And I'll never forget that. So Montague Cobb at Howard gave some very interesting lectures and talked about human variation and where he studied at Case Western. T. Wingate Todd was the major professor of anatomy there. And they basically started talking about a biological anthropology that would be useful. So a lot of the studies on health and physique, which is a whole nother side of biological anthropology. Some simply call it human biology as opposed to physical anthropology, which often worked on hard parts, skeletal remains. So you have people who do biological anthropology who also do things on studies related to food shortages and birth weight. famines and growth, those kinds of things. So there's an overlap there with medicine. So there's a natural root of biological anthropology within anatomy, within medicine. So the early anatomists who worked on the Nubian archaeological survey were people like Grafton Elliott Smith. They were anatomists, or people who had the MBBS, the medical degree, and they chose to specialize in anatomical studies. One other source of my interest was discovering not only Daniel Chu and Elliot Skinner's book, but also Ashley Montague's book on race, or one of his books on race, in which he talks about the misconception of race. Now, there are contradictions in all of these works, or in his work, but the fact is his heart was in the right place and his mind was in the right place. But sometimes the language we inherit straitjackets the way we think. And this is what we need to understand. Whether you're talking to your children, whether you're talking to the professors of the world, sometimes the vocabulary forces you to attempt to express things that actually need a new vocabulary. Old scientific terms that are no longer useful or that inaccurate are usually dropped. So we don't talk about phlogiston anymore as they would have in a certain era in Europe, because it was discovered that phlogiston was not a real thing. It was not a real thing. So that's a little bit about me. Born in South Carolina, grew up in Florida, discovered books at high school and junior high school that were useful, and at medical school, and being in Washington, a wonderful city, and studying skeletal biology with J. Lawrence Angel at the Smithsonian, who was an expert anatomist and a taskmaster when it came to measuring things and making sure that you didn't change your technique, being very cognizant of the possibility that your technique might change, but trying to be as true to what was accurate. And he was quite a character. He was a nice man, a 19th century liberal. Again, invited me into his laboratory, taught me the basics that I still remember, taught me how to hold calipers. And in addition to this, I would like to say that Dr. Angel was, what should I say? He sang in the choir in his church. He was someone who could read classical Greek. So what we see in Lawrence Angel's work is an effort to blend the biological and the historical. You could call him one of the authors of historical biology. His methods and some of his ideas would be regarded as old-fashioned now. Some of his approaches, some people would call him a typologist. He was not a typologist in the most negative sense, and I will not go into that here now. That's a hard thing, not a hard thing, but that's a very complicated thing to explain. It would take too much time to go into it here. But he was a nice man, and in fact, he made the cover of People magazine because he did forensic cases. The Smithsonian was involved in forensic work, so I learned some basic ideas and concepts about forensic anthropology, forensic skeletal biology from him. And unfortunately, and ironically, Larry Angel died after surgery because he got a transfusion that had hepatitis in it. So here we are again talking about a virus right now. Yeah. So
indeed.
There we go. So that's sort of in a nutshell. It explain. I've tried to. You asked me about myself, so I've tried to give you a picture of how my interest in Africa and human biology or biological anthropology came together.
Yes, I like to ask those questions to let everyone know that the people whose work we read, they are human beings, and it's not AI, that came up with these articles and these books, and that, uh,
Yeah,
they,
that's true. I'm very human and very much a person who uh, has his share of the nitty gritty of life stories, the problems, and some of the victories, and some of the loves, as well as the disappointments. So that is me. Yeah.
Indeed. Now we've thrown around the term biological anthropology. Can you, define it a little bit more for us, and to inform us of the types of questions that biological anthropology seeks to answer?
Sure. Now, anthropology is conceived in the United States because it is conceived in different places a little bit differently. Anthropology
Mhm,
is thought of as a quote, four-field discipline. So, what are the four fields? Uh, Cultural anthropology,
mhm,
linguistic anthropology, which has different shades, something that you're interested in,
mhm,
uh, physical anthropology, okay, the stuff that the things that I've been primarily interested in, although I'm interested in everything, but now called biological anthropology. And the last thing is what used to be called prehistoric archaeology. So let's just call it archaeology.
mhm,
In other places, the divisions fall a little bit differently, and the terminology is a little bit differently. For example, if you look at Adolf Ehrman's book, Life in Early Egypt from 1896, he talks about the question of the quote race origin of the Egyptians, and he says the philologists tell us one thing and the ethnologists tell us something different. He said the
mhm,
ethnologists said that their origin was African. So in this case, and then he goes on to say why. He points out that you cannot find a break in the populations, a sharp break as you go from Egypt to Lake Chad down to Nubia. And he writes this in 1896, and he says, well, the ethnologists say the Egyptians have an African origin, but the philologists say they have a Southwest Asian origin using
mhm,
language. So here we see this debate begin early on. What's interesting is that although we associate the 19th century with racism, colonialism, and so forth, and appropriately so, or the 18th century, 19th century, it's very interesting that when you read some of the old works carefully and you read widely, you find some interesting opinions that go against a simplistic notion of racism and colonialism. This is not to say that I'm cheering, you know, 19th century Germans or what have you. It is to simply acknowledge the complex truth. And this is what we have to do always.
mhm. Now you spoken about, you introduced the racial conversation concerning ancient Egypt, and you're kind of known for trying to expand our conceptualization of this term, race, and in how in many respects this is the inappropriate or archaic language, as you would say, concerning these conversations. So what are some of the underlying issues and misconceptions of the concept of race, and especially as applied to ancient Egypt, saying in African history in general,
Now,
or just world
uh,
history in general?
see,
Yeah.
what you would like to do, Mr. Imhotep, is be here for 36 hours. But I don't think we have that kind of time, do we? Uh,
No.
let's do a kind of a thought experiment. Let's think about this.
Okay.
When we use the word race, what the word race is often meant for many people is a collection of people where everyone in that group, I mean, or a classification of people where everyone in the subgroups were more like each other than not like each other. In other words, an idea that if you belong to race X, that you're more like everybody else in that race than you are to anybody else. And this idea is connected to something called typology, but let's not spend a lot of time talking about that. So in our current, or in the discourse that emerged in the 20th century, this was often the idea. Now, this is the concept which has to be divorced from certain types of practices. I mean, they are related, but they're not the same thing. Now, at another conceptual level, though, race as a term, or race as a term within taxonomy, is equivalent to the subspecies level in the Linnaean taxonomic hierarchy. So if you remember from school, you learned about genus, species, families, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So race would be at the level of subspecies and would be the equivalent of that. Okay. Now, for Darwin, in order to say that a species, if you read Darwin, several of Darwin's books, read it very carefully, in effect, what he implies is that in order for population, or I mean, a species to be divided into subspecies, that those populations have to essentially be incipient species. So we're talking about very well differentiated, very distinct. Okay. Now, I've given you a background, a conceptual background, and is a background that immediately has been violated even by people who talked about race in the 19th century. People like Knott and Glidden, whose names many of your audience will know. These were the people who, along with Morton, praised Samuel Morton for saying that the Egyptians were simply Caucasian. And, although when you read Knott and Glidden very, very carefully, you see that because they, if you read them carefully, they actually go against Morton at a certain point. They say, well, these people were African. They even use the word Negroid, but they were not akin to any Negroes. So how do you reconcile this dissonance? It's very easy. You just have to understand them. Knott and Glidden were polygenicists. They believed that each group, what they call each race, had a separate origin, and sometimes even a separate primate origin. So if you look at some of these old books, so you might have some individuals that may have shaded off or kind of looked like people in some vague way from another group, but that's an accident. Okay. Now this kind of, I've opened up something here that actually can get you in a lot of trouble, in the sense that you need to read a whole lot of stuff to understand this. And people will have to do that. It's actually quite interesting if you look at Knott and Glidden. Now, but what I want to say about Knott and Glidden here too is to point out a very interesting paradox. While Knott and Glidden were talking about how distinct and people like Morton said, oh, well, some people would say that the races are almost separate species, et cetera. At the very same time this was going on, or actually before this time, you had laws being created in the southern United States around a social use of race and who was going to be called a Negro. And so in South Carolina, to bring up the good old home state again, the rule was written that anyone that had any known Negro ancestry, any known African ancestors or tropical African ancestors, but any known Negro ancestors would be called colored, a Negro, black, what have you. It's very interesting that when you read the reports of the South Carolina legislature at that time, when they're debating this, men stand up, and they were all white men. They said, if you make the rule this way, you will affect some of the best families in Orangeburg. Guess who was born in Orangeburg? Me. But they weren't talking about me. They were talking about those people who, at the time of the Revolutionary War, before the lines had hardened totally, where you had situations like you have in South America, people of mixed ancestry who were very fair, but who had known African ancestry were actually marrying into, the quote unquote white, white society, or they were part of it. And this happened in America. Now, of course, in South America, this was the rule. Whole populations disappeared. Okay, but let's move on. Now, in terms of the Linnaean taxonomic hierarchy, I use the word subspecies. Race is the equivalent of subspecies for most taxonomists and most systematists. In the 1950s through the mid-1960s, there was a debate in a journal called Systematic Zoology, which you would find quite interesting, about the utility of the subspecies. These were people arguing not about people, but about elephants, butterflies, what have you. Do these animals really, is the subspecies designation really useful? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And what they pointed out were four major things that were problematic in terms of determining these subspecies. They found that there was a non-concordance of traits. Okay. That means simply that for a group of individuals that you've grouped, that you've turned into created a classification for, that if you change the characteristics that you look at, you would actually get different individuals grouping in different places. Okay. So, and this is because the traits that they're looking at, the traits are the variants of the characters. Okay. Characters and traits are not the same thing. So let's say that, you talk about coat color. Coat color is a character. A blue coat is a trait. A yellow coat is a trait. So you would get non-concordance of these things. So you wouldn't get the same grouping of individuals if that had been the basis of determining your subspecies. Okay. One of the other things is that the criteria that were used was arbitrary. They would say things like, 60% must be different from 90% of another group. Okay, that's another thing. Another thing was the existence of polytopicity. Polytopicity refers to the fact that in far-flung geographical regions, highly separated, you might find animals within a genus or species that were very similar to each other. And obviously, if you think that your taxonomy is supposed to reflect relationship, which is what Darwin said, they couldn't be closely related. Okay.
Is this connected to the concept of convergence?
Yeah, or microconvergence. Microconvergence, yeah, you could say that. Or parallelism, which is not the same as convergence. Convergence, we normally think of it in terms as being related. We think of it like in macroevolution, although not always. So whales and fish have tails. They swim in the sea, but whales are mammals and fish are fish. Okay, different things. And the other, so I talked about polytopicity, similarities that were due to, parallelism or microconvergence, convergence. You have to be careful about the language. And the other thing was the existence of demes within the subspecies that had already been erected. You have to remember that this is all connected. When I disagree with people who say that everybody who was interested in classifying people, 200 years ago was an obligatory racist. The reason I say I disagree with that, at least in principle, is because at that time, and in all parts of the world, whether they were writing about it or not, people had notions of how to organize the world. Okay,
Mhm.
and they developed classifications. So if you go to someplace in the Himalayas where people were not doing formal taxonomy, they have a notion about what plants go together based on their similarity, what trees go together. Sometimes it's actually remarkably similar to what Western science came up with, and sometimes it's not. So within the subspecies, now we're still talking about animals and plants now. It was the existence, the fourth thing was the existence of demes. And demes were actual real breeding populations that were highly differentiated, and sometimes within something that had been designated a subspecies, right?
Mhm.
Uh, or a race, you actually found a population that would actually meet the qualifications better and would have to be taken out. So and so this, in terms of zoological taxonomy, this causes a real problem, because in theory your taxonomy should have a use. Now, those four things also apply to people. Okay, they apply to
Mhm.
people, and but there are some additional things that when anthropologists and geneticists started looking at this question, again, let's be clear. You have to be very clear on what it is you're concerned about. The notion of race implies fundamental differences and high levels of distinction between the things that have been designated races. In theory, they imply groups of uniform individuals that are homogeneous. The groups are homogeneous in the sense of having uniform individuals that are not very much similar to each other. That's
Mhm.
the concept behind it. Even in South Carolina, now this is how thinking gets stretched. You say, well, wait a minute, how could people think that way and come up with the notion of like the Negro type, the true Negro, those types of things that you've heard about? But yet in South Carolina, you got a definition that says, well, no, a Negro is anybody with any African blood. So we have Nordic Negroes. We have, and we have some uh, friends of my family in South Carolina, people that look no different than any English person or any Swede, but they were
Mhm.
part of the colored community. So how is it possible for the people that set that up to be also connected to the science that wants to, talk about a level of uniformity within a group, when in fact African Americans were anything but uniform?
So,
Tie,
you
tie. Let me just put the tie.
okay.
The tie between those two concepts is the notion that having any quote so-called Negro blood is a stigma and a taint and changes anything else.
Hmm.
So it's a conceptual kind of type as opposed to an actual physical kind of type where everybody would be of a particular face or have a particular set of characteristics. Okay, all right.
Mhm.
You see, so it's a
Yeah.
conceptual thing. Okay, and it doesn't make any sense, which is why ordinary people, when they look at people, they say, well, those people don't look like us. But the US government still does what? It says if you come from North Africa, this place, that place, that you are to mark white on the census forms, because
Mhm.
they have this thing that says, oh, any of the original races of North Africa. Well, if you take the Carunian skull, for example, that Matzi Hindenburg studied, that was excavated by Fred Windorf and his group many years ago. If you look at the analysis that Hindenburg did on that skull, it it is most similar to either material from Wadi Halfa or from Uganda. It is
Mhm.
not, and it's from the Fayum, 8,000 years old. So it's 6,000 BC. It's the oldest skull we have from that area. Now it's just one, so a sample of one means
Mhm.
nothing. But the point is that for those who are putting forth a hypothesis, any example that counters it negates the hypothesis because of the way they talk about hypothesis testing. That's another issue. Now, to talk about human beings, let's that all of that is a lot of background and the stuff that we all know in a way. Well, we're familiar in a way. The in more recent writings about why the term race is inapplicable to people. Let's leave Darwin aside. The other thing people have said, they say the within group variation is greater than the between group, which is another way of saying that of the things that were labeled races, Negroid, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, what have you, that you can find individuals in those groups who are more similar to each other when you look at all of the domains of biology, excluding the traits that you've used to classify them, meaning the external traits, which gets back to natural history, right? Once you look at the molecular level, you can find people who are more similar in these groups than they are even similar to people not only in the groups that they classify with or that they are grouped with, but even in their own families. And how is it that we all know this? How is it that we all know this? Did you know, Asar, that all of us know what I just said, and we just don't think of it? How do we know it? Now I'm asking you. I'm interviewing you.
Well,
what example? Just one example. Just one example. How do we know? How do we know that it's not true that everybody within these so-called racial groups that we've received, the received racial taxa, we shouldn't call them categories.
Yeah.
How do we know? Well, I'm going to answer it for you because I know we have limited time. When you have to have a transplant or a blood transfusion, it is very possible, especially in terms of a transplant and a 6-antigen transplant, it is very possible that the person who you have a match with, a genetic match with, is somebody from the other side of the earth, and that your own parents and your own siblings will not match with you. So if you cannot even match for something that's important, and see, this is where it gets in the valuation, the subjectivity here, it gets into it. If you can't even match with your brother for a kidney to get a complete match, then what does that say about a notion that you are connected to all these other people in an important way? Now, this doesn't mean that there are no genealogical connections. That's a different issue. But let me just finish this piece. The other thing that we know about the notion of race is what Ehrman talked about in a way, is that that destroys it, is that variation amongst human beings is clinal. So you get a gradual change in skin color. For Ehrman, he talked about a gradual change in people. So there's no sharp divisions. So clinal variation, a gradual change. Expressed in terms of autosomal DNA, we would say a gradient of differentiation. A gradient of differentiation. Okay. And the last thing that I like to add to that is that when you look at all of the genetic studies, you find out that at least in some of the genetic studies, some of the so-called major racial groups don't seem to have an independent history. They actually seem to be have a lot of seem to be the products of mixture. There was a study by Ann Bocock and Cavalli Sforza in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 1991, where they basically came up with the conclusions that it's easier to understand Europeans as being a product of a mixture of Proto-Africans and Proto-Asians and a back admixture in the Near East that goes into Europe in terms of their autosomal picture. Now, as opposed to the way we normally think about things, we think about a tree, right? A tree, a dendrogram, and it splits and it divides, and we imply that each branch is totally distinct, when in actual fact, there is mixture going back and forth between the branches. So instead of thinking about a strict dendrogram, which is how we many people think about it and approach it, and even I publish stuff like that, it's better to think in terms of a network. And there may be some average differences, but people are connected. So just remember that all populations are related, just to different degrees. All individuals are related, and any individual in a given breeding population may have ancestry that's not identical to people. Now, and ancestry is different than just a genetic profile. So I probably said too much about what you talked about in terms of race. Now, let's bring it back to what you asked about it in a different way. That's the all of the theoretical. That's the scientific undergirding. What's very, very important to understand is that yes, there are genealogical connections between people. Yes, families are real, but families have come together, broken apart. Communities have come together and broken apart over tens of thousands of years. Yes, in parts of the world where there's been uh, populations that have stayed in one place, you can find certain genetic pictures that seem to emerge when you use a lot of DNA. And what you're basically doing is you're describing a locale based on local phenomena, and that allows you to put a person in a particular region. That's the whole basis of ancestry testing, along with the fact that ancestry testing also has a database with people in it. So it puts you, it may group you with people that you're most similar to. That's one method, and other methods, the profile. But remember this: there was no France 10,000 years ago. See,
Mhm.
so there was no a lot of things or no places 10,000 years ago. So once you keep that in mind, then you begin to be able to get a feeling for, huh, well, we should think about these things differently. Okay, we should think about this whole notion of what people are calling race differently. So when you come to the Nile Valley, when you come to Africa, I talk about uh, biogeography, emergence, and biological history. So a population that has emerged in a particular locale from local ancestors, even if they've absorbed other people, but in a local environment, particular locale, shaped by the social mores of the people that were there, as well as the physical environment, that population belongs where it is. So, you look at some people, Amazic from Northwest Africa, so-called Berber speakers, and sometimes they have blonde hair, red eyes, blue eyes rather, whatever. So, well, are they Africans? Yes, they're Africans. There's nobody who speaks Berber. There's nobody who does their customs anyplace else other than Africa. Does this mean that all of their proximate ancestry is African? Because we're all Africans. If you use an evolutionary model, okay, modern human beings emerge from an archaic African population. Uh, they migrate out of Africa. In some cases, they intermarry to some degree with other archaic populations like Neanderthals, who themselves have an ultimate African origin. So you don't escape Africa. You can't run away from it. It's there. Okay, it's there. And even some of the archaic populations that may have been still around in Africa after, quote, modern Africans. And this gets into a technical thing about where do you divide lines? Where do you divide an evolutionary lineage? How do you divide it, and what have you? But the people along the Nile River emerged, their culture emerged there. I like to think in terms of biology and culture. I like to think in terms of if you want to talk about so-called identity. And the other thing about Africa too that you have to remember in a model-based approach is that if Africa is the origins of modern people, and if they left via Northeast Africa, that route going into Asia, then there have to be some people in Africa who are more similar to some people outside of Africa than they are to other Africans, since there have been modern people in Africa longer than there have been modern people any place else. So this whole issue about classifying things based on simple similarity as opposed to model-based approach of understanding genealogy, or the idea that you can't have a population in place X that
Mhm.
that has different elements in its ancestry and still be authentically of that place is totally incorrect, and is not the way a good scientist or a good population historian would think about things. But we do have a legacy of having to deal with not the 19th century polygenism, notions of pure groups, notions of
Mhm.
distinctness, and ranked in a particular way. And I haven't even talked about how the concept of race is connected to a notion of some groups being better than other groups. In fact, the recent declaration by the German Zoological Society last year called the Jena Declaration or Genea Declaration, Jenaer or Jena, you can look it up, says very explicitly that classification of races was preceded by racism, that it is
Mhm.
racism that led to that. Like I said, I don't necessarily believe that, but I think it's very important that Germans would say this, so
Mhm.
I think that has its own interest and should be worked with.
We now I have my own uh thoughts on that, and I would word it a little differently.
Sure.
That has to deal with this cultural notion that there's a hierarchy in existence, to where there's God, then there's like the angels or certain spirit beings that are, the workers of God, then there's humans, and then there's animals, and then insects, and then just the natural typology. So like I
Mhm.
forgot what they call it in like cultural anthropology, but you get
Great
this.
chain of being.
Yes, that's it, the great chain of being.
But that didn't really come from quote cultural anthropology because there was no such thing when that idea emerged. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so and then you have, because there's a hierarchy there,
Hmm.
that when in the human group there's a hierarchy within it, and then of
Okay.
course people who hold that idea,
Hmm.
their group, however they categorize it, is at the top, and then everyone else is more closely is not ranked, as they're not human, so to speak,
Hmm.
but they're like half human, half quote unquote animal, and more closer to the animal,
Hmm.
hierarchy. And this is kind of shaped how, going into more formalized,
Yeah, yeah,
racism
yeah,
as we
yeah.
see.
Well, yeah, but that's not inconsistent with what I've said. I was
Yeah.
pointing out that you will have people today who subconsciously, let me just say this, who
uh,
subconsciously hold on to these hierarchical notions, although what they write and what they say will be opposite. So their social
yeah.
lives and their scientific lives are different, but sometimes their social lives creep into their science. And I can give you examples of that. In fact, we can talk about this mummy genomes paper at some
Mhm.
point if you're interested. But go ahead, you've got the podium here.
Well,
Well, not the podium, but you know what I mean.
before we get to the that genome paper,
Or
let's
anything. No, we
discuss.
don't have to talk about that at all. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, but let's get on the genetics aspect. Like what role does that play in the reconstruction, for example, of African history, and what is its strengths and limitations in terms of using that information? Because
You
I
mean
see a
you
lot
mean,
of,
you mean biological information?
yeah, well, genetics in terms, because okay, let me put it in greater context. So you have these discussions now where people are trying to have those old arguments in terms of where did the ancient Egyptians come from, right? And so they're and who are they more closely related to? People on the continent of Africa, and if so, where? Or people in Asia, South West Asia, or Europe, or whatnot. And so there you have a lot of laypersons as well as specialists who are trying to use genetic information
Mm-hmm.
to make these arguments
Mm-hmm.
in terms of uh, ancient Egypt, saying its culture and things of that nature. And so, just wanted to discuss, the role of genetics in terms of reconstructing, history in terms of migrations, interactions, uh, you know,
Mm.
haplogroups, types, I guess, however you would categorize it, and to what extent, what are its strengths in terms of reconstructing history, and what are its limitations?
Well,
What can we answer with it, and what can't it answer in
well,
terms of genetics?
well. See, but you're talking about many things at once. When you talk
Okay.
about history, the only thing that genetics is going to tell you about, perhaps, is something about population history. It's not going to tell you about linguistic history.
Hmm.
It's not going to tell you about stone tool history. It's not going to tell you about ceramics and the culture, history. You know, uh, the fact that we have people within the Afro North American community, as we talked about earlier, who could pass for white. Adam Clayton Powell is as much an African American as anybody else. So,
Hmm.
and there's no way around that. Okay, so you can talk about affinity of different elements in a population, or that a population may have uh, uh, different peoples may have come in to form it. And so you have to think about populations as being ensembles, as opposed to being like collections of helium atoms where all of the atoms are uniform and the same. But the locale of emergence of the population is what
Hmm.
identifies it in the way that I conceptualize it. Also, remember that as I said, modern people have been in Africa longer than any place else, right? They
Hmm.
left, right? And whatever was the source population, assuming that you can have a residual signal, whatever the source population is, there's going to be some people in Africa who are more like those people. But you've got to think of it in terms of the model and the direction of change. It's not so much that those people in Africa are more like those people than they're like other Africans. It's more like those people outside of Africa are like a particular group of Africans, because then they are nested within the phylogenetic tree of modern humans. Okay, so it depends on what level. It depends on levels that you're talking about, and this is a different thing. And you have to think about this. This isn't something that just pops out at you. So this doesn't mean what I just said doesn't de-Africanize Berbers. It doesn't matter what anybody says. It doesn't de-Africanize what ancient Egyptians. Uh, People may absorb different pieces of culture from different places, in the same way that anything gets absorbed and incorporated. We're speaking English now. Okay, what does that mean? Does that mean we're Anglo-Saxons that came from Saxony in northern Germany? I don't think
Hmm.
so. Okay,
So,
so what I'm
are
asking for is a complex. What I'm asking for is for us to grasp an understanding that deals with concept of emergence, the locale of emergence, and understanding how that's connected to what came before in that area. And that is what gives us a formula for it.
hmm
When you actually do analyses on, say, for example, the crania, excuse me, from early El Badari, uh, you will see, whether it's my analysis or anybody else's analysis, that they are very much similar, or they will cluster, or they will group with Nubians, and sometimes they will group, depending on who you're comparing things with other Africans. Uh, Grouping or affinity is not the same as saying that they're identical to something. This is another idea. So in the work that I do now, the way I conceptualize things, it has nothing to do with the old race concepts. I'm not
hmm
trying to fit things into a preconceptualized framework. Let us look at how things are related to each other, and using all kinds of information, understand how they emerged. That's what
it,
we want to do.
it kind of brings up the difficulty in trying to get rid of the old language and paradigm that has been established through the old colonial literature,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to, in modern times, get this sense of identity. So, for example, like when you look at the very dark skin and black by modern terms, people on the Andaman Islands,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have some that would categorize them as Africans, but from I assume a biological anthropological perspective, you couldn't classify them, saying as Africans, even though they have the quote unquote stereotypical features of certain people from um Central and, let's say, West Africa, for example.
Okay.
You know,
Let me deal with that. Remember, we talked about polytopicity. You used the word
yeah,
convergence yourself.
uh-huh,
There's another word called simplesiomorph. So there may be some traits that were retained from early human ancestors. Of course, we don't understand, we don't know what early human ancestors look like. We do know that light skin also evolved. There are genes for light skin that also evolved in Africa. Okay,
mhm,
so to talk about the Andaman Islanders, for example, they look a particular way, but I think that embedded in your question is a notion of 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 whether you mean it or not.
mhm,
One way to be an African, and
mhm,
or one way to be a particular kind of African, and then reverse engineering that, extrapolating it. What I'm talking about is accepting a notion of biogeography, that there's diversity in Africa, there's diversity in other places. You will get similarity related to climate and whatever, and there may be some similarity that's retained, from early humans that left Africa because it's in a similar environment. But uh, let's go back to our evolution of modern humans.
mhm,
Modern humans emerge. They leave Africa whatever year you pick.
mhm,
They leave once, they leave twice. In terms of modern humans, the moment they cross the Sinai, have they changed? No.
mhm,
Now, maybe 10,000 years later, at a molecular level, they're different. But remember, the early Cro-Magnon in Europe, the early moderns in Europe have what? They have a tropical body plan. So different aspects of the human organism or any animal's organism may change at different rates. So from that point of view, those Cro-Magnon, even though in terms of certain when they take ancient DNA from them and they say, oh, they're already Europeans, what in the world does that mean? It depends on what you want to look at. From the point of view of their tropical body plan, they still reflect their tropical origins in Africa.
mhm,
From a molecular point of view, certain things have changed. So we have to be able to hold in our mind that Africa is a place of great diversity, greatest diversity in one sense, perhaps, in the sense that all of the trunk lineages, whether you're talking about mitochondrial female lineages or Y chromosome lineages and even other things, are found in Africa. There are derivative things that are not found in Africa unless they've come back. But let me talk about coming back. If they've come back and been integrated into African societies and cultures and peoples and what have you, as John Erno said, they reflect the genuine African history. I mean,
mhm,
let's talk about, see, you have to think in terms, what is your timeline? What is your time? And so we have to avoid the kind of thinking that is colonialist, that is from the 19th, and that persists in some quarters of the way people categorize and arrange and put things in containers. They say one thing on one day, or they use one model, but then when it comes to certain other subjects, there's not a consistency. You can't connect the different levels, the macro with the micro, you know. So yeah, the Andaman Islanders are some Asian folks. Yeah, they are descendants of modern humans who went out there. Their DNA profiles are different than, other people in Africa who may have the same color.
mhm,
But they're humans, they're human beings, but they belong right where they are. They belong right where they are. they did not, I can't tell you, I don't know personally when the Andaman Islands were first inhabited by modern humans. They say Australia 50 to 60,000 years ago, depending on who you read.
Mm-hmm.
So people got there, they got to Australia, they went through Asia to Australia before they inhabited Europe, or at least successfully colonized Europe at a level. So we have to think in terms of these processes of you have people migrating, and while they're migrating, they have molecular changes, neutral mutations going on. Natural selection is working on certain aspects of the physical traits. You have all sorts of demographic things going on in terms of survival accidents, somebody falls off the side of the mountain, or in terms of birth rates, something happens, measles or whatever disease existed, I don't know, 40, 30,000, 20,000 years ago. These things are all shaping the populations that are in motion. They're shaping them within Africa and outside of Africa. We're dealing with a question about what do you want to call something, and that's interesting. Within Africa, we need to give more attention to the Saharan region and how it has become wet, or let's say less dry and more dry off and on, and how that facilitated population movements around the continent, even before modern people left Africa, as well as in the immediate period before the emergence of food producing cultures in the Nile Valley and other places, and what have you. Other people, and you may want to try to connect that to, depending on what time depth you're dealing with language families and so forth. But it's and language is another area with the whole issue of how do you classify something. That's something that you have a personal interest in, and I'm not going to go there with you because I don't know what you know about that. But I freely admit that I accept certain standard classifications, but I'm different than simply accepting that, because I also am willing to acknowledge that for any given speech family, language family, you may find all kinds of elements there. Also, just like modern English has a lot of French words and as well as this quote unquote Germanic root, but it's got these Greek words and Latin words. Does that make it any less, English or Germanic? No. Is Swahili any less Bantu if we accept these words? I would challenge you to say, okay, do we even need this net that was set up for us? And I don't believe that Greenberg was some bad person or what have you. My point is that I'm willing to accept some sort of statistical approach with computers and stuff. I'm willing to give that a try. Other people may not be willing to give that a try. But in the meantime, until that's sorted out, well, yeah, I will talk about ancient Egyptian, for example, being Afroasiatic. But what does that mean? That does not mean that ancient Egyptian doesn't have loan words or words in it that are from other African language phyla, and in a later period, borrowings from Asia, as Alain Anselim used to be very much willing to show cognates from ancient Egyptian into these other families. Gabor Takacs, Hungarian. So not all Europeans are wedded to, certain hard and fast ideas. This is what's important. So what we need is for people to be willing to help people to study and to be do serious scholastic work, find a way to get them the money to study and to get their degrees. And you just have to publish your work and argue for your work. And over time, it makes its impact, and that's what you do. Of course, I'm just preaching to the choir here, this, but I'm just saying this is what has to be done. And you can take positions, that not everybody, not all of the Europeans accepted Greenberg. But anyway, back to what you had, the biology piece. Populations are ensembles. If you look at the short tandem repeats, depending on how you sample, and this is another issue too, in any part of the world where there's great diversity and a complex population history, you cannot sample one locale and claim that you have sampled and that you understand the whole place across time and space. This is a big problem. You cannot overgeneralize and
Mhm.
on anything. You should talk about what you have there and focus on that, which is the kind of thing that Alain Anselin did with linguistics. He focused on what he had, what he was talking about, and he focused on that. Same is true in biology. I mean, you have to have a larger context. You asked a question about reconstruction. I don't like the notion using the term reconstructing African history. What
Mhm.
we're really doing is constructing a narrative. We are constructing a narrative based on the best evidence that we can have and good methods. The same is done when you write American history and you're reading what Thomas Jefferson or whoever wrote this or that,
Mhm.
or what happened in the war. When you sit down to write your history of the War of 1812, you are constructing a narrative
Mhm.
based on the materials. Oh, I'm writing the history of 1812. You have constructed a narrative and you have selected the materials that you think are most important. So selectivity is also a part of this. So let's be very clear at a pedagogical and epistemological level about, these things, theory and methods at this.
Mhm.
Let's be very, very clear and understand that that the best work that we do uh, has to be honest, it has to have integrity, but it has to acknowledge its limitations.
Mhm.
You weren't in the War of 18, you weren't there at the War of 1812. You
Mhm.
don't know what the British generals were thinking on day X in daytime or what the Americans, you weren't there. And even if you had been there, you still wouldn't necessarily know whatever. So all of the events that played out moment to moment. You're familiar with the term ideographic,
Mhm.
ideographic versus nomothetic.
Mhm.
Explanation in science has generally been said to be nomothetic, based on general laws and principles. The notion of explanation in history, or rather the term that's often been used to describe explanation in history, is that it's ideographic, that it's based on moment to moment changes, contingent events. Now, obviously, these are two different levels, and they're not mutually exclusive in every case. So if I fall off the mountain tomorrow, the nomothetic explanation is that, oh, gravity made me fall, I slipped and gravity brought me down and crushed my body. And my
Mhm.
wife had to come and get me, right? Okay,
Mhm.
so that's a nomothetic explanation. Gravity, that's the broad scientific principle. The ideographic explanation is that, oh, I put my foot in the wrong hole. It wasn't firm and secure, and I can give a step-by-step account of the steps and missteps that I made. That would be an ideographic explanation of
Mhm.
why I fell off the mountain. You see
Mhm.
the distinction.
Yes.
You know the distinction yourself. So
Yeah.
I mean, but it's important that we talk uh, to all of the interested parties, and that we get young people interested in wanting to do scholastic work, and that we find the money within all communities. I would say we have a special interest in the Afro North American community, but we have to have a broader interest in the Afro diasporic community, Afro Latin community, the Latin community in general, which has some Afro in it, even when it's not
Mhm.
called Afro Latin. That's a whole nother discussion, right? About
Mhm.
this whole notion of when is something a mixture or when is something an ensemble. I mean, there is no Cuban music without Africa. There is no
Mhm.
Brazilian music without Africa. Whether it's called Afro Brazilian, I mean, because it has. So it gets into an interesting question. At what point do you put a certain prefix on something when you
Mhm.
know all along? So you may have the person who plays, who said, "Oh, I'm from Mexico." Oh, do you have any African ancestry? Oh, I don't think so. No, I'm just a regular Mexican. Then you do their DNA test,
Mhm.
and they have 20% African ancestry, but you got some people that live 10 miles down the road from them who look the same and they say, oh, no, we're Afro Mexicans.
Mhm.
You see, this is about
Yeah.
naming, the philosophy of naming, how we look at how we attach things to things.
Mhm.
There's a lot to this actually, and we can't go into all of it at this point.
Yes, it reminds me of a time I went to a DIOP conference some years ago, and there was a group of scholars who came from Canada who, if you look at them, they look closer to quote unquote Europeans, but they consider themselves Black African, and they tell the history of this particular town which they live, which a lot of enslaved Africans, either escaped or was brought to in Canada. And of course, with them being such small numbers in comparison to the larger population over time, they integrated or genetically mixed, so to speak, with these Europeans, but they kept their identity more
Yes.
so still as
And
Afro Canadians. I don't know if
right, sure,
they,
right.
they use
So,
that
so,
term. So
but Asar, how is that any different?
yeah,
Now, in those people's cases, maybe they did it by choice.
yeah,
But how is that any different than people like Adam Clayton Powell
mm-hmm,
Jr. and other groups, or Walter White, or my own advisor at Howard University, Sterling Lloyd? All of them look like Europeans,
mm-hmm,
but they were Afro-North Americans. Now, you could argue that in the case of America, you had a social system that constrained them, and that these Canadians could have simply not mentioned it and said that, they just function as white Canadians, but they
mm-hmm,
chose to identify with that, with their African side. So you brought up a point that I've mentioned a little bit recently somewhere else. You can be Afro descendant or a Greek descendant, but not Greek identified or
mm-hmm,
Afro identified. And
mm-hmm,
sometimes you have people, we are so used to the idea that people would not want to be Black people that we find it odd when we run into somebody like Johnny Otis. Do you know who Johnny Otis was?
mm-hmm,
Johnny Otis was an impresario of rhythm and blues. You'd have to talk to your parents in the 50s, in the 60s. But Johnny Otis, I mean, I thought Johnny Otis was just another Afro North American,
mm-hmm,
or like I like to say, Middle Passage American, like Adam Clayton Powell, just another light-skinned, straight-haired, African American. But Johnny Otis was actually, both of his parents were from Greece. And in an interview 6-7 years ago or something like that, Johnny Otis said, "I made a decision that if I was going to live my life as an American, I would live my life as a Black American." And he basically, quote unquote, passed for white. And of course, I am sure that for white Southerners, they just assumed that he was just another high yellow Black person, because
mm-hmm,
who would want to be Black? See, this is what we have to deal with this. Well, Johnny Otis wanted to be Black and lived his life as a Black person. I don't view him as somebody who was slumming. I don't view him. It's an interesting question, though. He was given a passport to Afro North America. His wife was African American. His son is Shuggy Otis, the blues guitarist.
mm-hmm.
But if you look back and look up Johnny Otis, he's the one. If you've ever heard that record, you're from Texas, the hand jive, that's a Johnny Otis song, man. Johnny Otis was even in a book called Great American Negroes, which is funny for a lot of different reasons. Because once again you get to this notion of Negro as a type, a physical type, which in terms of philosophy, you can talk about extreme variance, but you cannot talk about types, because types are constructions; they're not real. And in fact, Europeans like Peschel and others, Loring Brace's great-great-grandfather, said, "Oh, when you actually go to Africa, the Negro type is rare." I didn't say that. They said that a long time ago. So what they're saying is that an extreme caricature of certain physical traits that have come to be, as you call them, stereotypical African. They say, if you go around enough, you'll find in every community, you'll find that, hey, you don't find very many people, if any, who are actually like that, who meet that stereotype. So it's very important to understand these concepts, because when you get into debates and discussions with other people, Don't be straitjacketed by their language. See, this is the problem. See, that language is incorrect. And once you step into that arena and agree to use that language structures your conclusions. If it's sort of like the when people talk about positivism in terms of the philosophy of science, you know, the problem is with the descriptors, because built into the descriptions is the conclusion.
Exactly.
Because the descriptions limit how you can think about things. Very important point. So when I talk about African biogeography, African peoples, African populations, population biology, when it's just strictly on biology, when you talk about gene flow, what are the forces of microevolution? What are they there? Adaptation, genetic drift, and gene flow, and some would add social or sexual selection. Let me give you a small thought experiment. Imagine that you have an island somewhere, and on that island, you put a group of people, one of each, I mean, all of whom to a person, each person, male and female, have a parent that is from group A and a parent from group B. So everybody is an AB person on that island. And let us imagine that the people from A had one skin color and people from B had another skin color in great contrast. And you put them on this island and you seal the island. So anytime they marry each other, everybody has the same proportion of what? A and B ancestry. But some people are going to look a little different in the next generation, a little different. Some may have a little lighter skin, a little darker skin. Imagine that you have cultural values that value one, a lighter skin or a darker skin over the other skin color. You can still push the mean. You come back 1,000 years later, people will still be 50-50 in terms of AB, in terms of their ancestral tree, but those particular physical traits, but they may have pushed the mean on the physical traits. You get what I'm saying? Based on values, based on cultural values. Yeah. Anyway, so
I wanted to ask quickly, like I'm trying to bring certain things based on certain conversations in the social media sphere.
sure.
One of the things that I always caution against is, and this is going to lead back to something that you mentioned earlier, but that just because a population is present in current times does not mean that, let's say 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago, that the current population are the direct descendants of those earlier populations in a particular center.
Yeah, that's what I said earlier. I said, remember, there was no France 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago. Right.
Yeah.
So it's funny, somebody gets their DNA profile back and it says, oh, they're 20% French, 30% this, and 4% Neanderthal. As though there were French people hanging out with Neanderthals. Right. Yeah. So anyway, but and I've said that to deliberately exaggerate a point. And I want to be perfectly clear. The people that somebody like Johnny Otis worked with or was amongst, they accepted him. Now, somebody has pointed out, I'm sure someone will point out that, you know, he could have always done this and that. He could have always gone the other way or left. Yeah, that may be true, but we're talking about a community accepting people. I'm trying to have you understand this. You're familiar with Matthew Henson, right? Do you know how many? Do you know how many African Americans? Do you know how many children that Matthew Henson had?
That I do not know.
Do you know what state they live in? They live in Greenland, and they're not African Americans. They were Inuit. Matthew Henson only has Inuit children, at least in terms of genealogical descent. Now, I think that I read someplace that when Matthew Henson got back from one of his expeditions, North Pole after being away for 2 years or whatever, that his wife had a baby there, or that there was a baby in his house, but obviously he wasn't the father of that child. Now,
Yeah.
based on English common law, since married women cannot have bastards, if that happens to you, that child is still yours. But I'm
Yeah.
trying to make another point.
Mhm.
Matthew Henson's genealogical descendants. And this is another thing I want to say too. You have to make a distinction. When we talk about gene flow, a lot of people think in terms of gene flow as something that increases genetic variability and diversity. It does that. But the people in my department at Oxford did a series of papers a long time ago where their focus was on the fact that gene flow increased or changed your ancestors too, your relatedness. Not often talked about.
Hmm.
So those are actually two different things, you know. And I could give you an example if you wish, but go ahead. I don't want to monopolize the time here.
No, I was saying that in terms of, because we have, these discussions about, the degrees of relationships between people, for example, in the Nile Valley and
Mm-hmm.
people in West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And, some people will say, well, there's not, any quote unquote West African genes, in terms of ancient Egypt, but I also caution, that first of all, you don't have a lot of genetic studies dealing with ancient remains of West Africans to say
Mm-hmm.
if those West Africans have been there, saying for however many years.
Uh-huh.
But also going back to that particular study you had mentioned, uh, where they did the 3 samples and determined that, the ancient Egyptians were more closely related to, Syrians and people out of Southwest Asia. And so
Mm-hmm.
just dealing with the main issue here in terms of research methodology, and what are the types of things that you should be uh, concerned about when you're analyzing research papers or doing your own research yourself. Like, what are some of the pitfalls that we should avoid, and what are the types of questions that we should be asking every time when we're reading this data,
Okay.
concerning
All right.
migrations, genetics, things of that nature.
Okay. Now, okay.
I know
Once
that's
again,
another 3-hour
no, no,
conversation,
no,
but
no. I'm going to talk about it very quickly
okay.
uh, for different reasons. Let me say this to you. Um, in terms of looking for identical genetic sequences in one place versus another place, you don't have to have identical genetic sequences to have a genealogical connection. Okay. So when we look at the E haplogroup, for example, the PN2 transition or the P2 transition is the father of the M35 lineage, which goes up from Somalia into Egypt, over to Morocco, Mauritania, the Sahara. And it is also the father of the M2 lineage that characterizes most of tropical Africa. So there is a connection between these regions. It's an old connection, it's a real connection. And that connection emerges after modern people have left Africa. Okay? So once again, you have to accept the idea or understand the idea rather that Africa equal diversity, and there's many ways to be an African. If you look at some recent studies that were done on, again, small samples in some places, you'll find that the short tandem repeats data will basically show Nubian Egypt to be the same, but also Egypt to be very overlap greatly with some place like Sicily. So you have some parts of the world that have this very general background. I mean, it's one way to think about it.
Mhm.
Uh, so I think that it's very, very important for people to understand the trap of talking about genetics in a particular way. You know, there is a genealogical connection between Nile Valley peoples and other peoples in Africa, both along the northwest Mediterranean coast as well as in Nubia and further south. And depending on which marker you pick, there are connections. If you're looking for a direct connection, you may not find that in an easy way. Although, like you say, there haven't been there haven't been a lot of studies, and there haven't been a lot of remains covered from West Africa anyway of the right time date. Nothing would surprise me though at all, you know. But Egypt is in Africa. The Nile Valley population emerged in Africa, assembled from its African components, uh, accepting others into it. It's in the northeast quadrant of Africa, which is where modern people left Africa. So you wouldn't expect what we call the autosomal background in the northeast quadrant of Africa to be the same as West Africa anyway, based on an evolutionary scientific model. Okay. Now, you know, when it comes to the other type of work, you talked about linguistics and so forth. People need to study. They need to get degrees, and if they wish to enter debates, but hopefully you don't study these things just to have a fight. I'm not having any fights with anybody. You know, either you understand, either you are consistent as a scholar, and either you're intellectually dishonest or you're not. Period. So you may be wrong,
Yeah.
and you have to admit that you may be wrong. Now let me show you something else that I think I have. Hold on for a second, if I can find it. I was going to show you something from Ahmed Batrawi's book, where he is contrasting. You remember we talked about the non-concordance of traits?
Mm-hmm.
So if you believe in the typological notion of race, then when you see a certain set of skeletal features, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Certain set of skeletal features, it's supposed to have a certain type of hair, and vice versa. You're supposed to be able to reverse engineer it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But if you have an evolutionary model, an evolutionary idea about diversity occurring in a space, then you don't get into a problem. But in Ahmed Batrawi's book, he has a picture in one of his works of a skull, and what the picture says is this: typical Negro hair. That's what he says.
Mm-hmm.
And then he looks at the face not typically Negro.
Mm-hmm.
What he's describing, or for people for whom this is a problem, is a dissonance between a facial skeleton, a narrow nose, and face, certain other things that I will not get into the technical pieces of it, and the hair on top of the head. Because if you believe certain things, and certain things are supposed to run parallel, be concordant with, run with certain other things, and it throws people off. There's also an article in 1933 in the Journal of Heredity where they have a Scandinavian woman, white as milk, Scandinavian woman, and she's got what they call self-bobbing hair. So she's got hair like yours. Exactly. The photograph is incredible. You know what the first question, one of the issues that the author had to deal with, guess, after all of what I've said, what issue did the author of that paper
Had to, in terms of how to categorize her, or she
well,
had
no,
any
no.
kind of like answer?
What did he have to say to assure, or to even to scientifically be clear on what people are looking at? What did he have to say? What do you think he had? What do you think was obligatory in his writing? What did he have to say right away, or say at some point in the piece? That this lady had no known Negro ancestors.
Yeah.
She had
Yeah.
Negro hair. This is what happens when you label things by groups instead of describing what you see. Describe
Mhm.
what you see, a narrow face, a narrow, don't call it a Caucasian nose,
Mhm.
Caucasian lips. No,
Yeah.
thin lips, narrow nose, narrow face, evolved in a hot, dry climate. You can find in Africa, you can find in Europe, find in some other places. You think about the language that you use. If you use the right language,
Yeah.
certain things melt away. Certain There are no problems. There are no issues. Now, other people may still have problems and issues, and I let them go. Have their problems and their issues. But there's no question. Now, the mummy genomes paper that you mentioned.
Yeah.
What are the problems? Let's just talk about two problems,
Mhm.
or just one problem, two ways. Overgeneralization. You
Mhm.
have one site in Egypt, and they generalize their findings, at least in their discussion, the way they talk about it, the way the public received it, even
Mhm.
if they didn't intend it. They general to all of Egypt over space and time. Although there's a caveat, they do say, well, if we'd sampled down near in southern Egypt near Sudanese border, maybe we would have gotten some different findings. But their whole discussion has generalized. They've already done the damage. It's like shouting fire in a theater. They've already done the damage. Also, their title is misleading. And in fact, there is scientific literature now that speaks to misleading titles, spin and titles that are basically lies or they're misleading. So that's one thing. The other thing, the other generalization, I said generalization two ways. They use a Yoruba sample as somehow representative of all of infra-Saharan Africa. I don't say sub-Saharan, I say infra-Saharan Africa. We need new language. So I like to talk about Saharan Africa, super-Saharan Africa. Egypt is primarily in Saharan Africa. Infra-Saharan Africa, why it doesn't have the cultural baggage connected to the what? Colonialist legacy. And infra-Saharan, Saharan, and super-Saharan Africa are connected by this E haplogroup, the Y chromosome lineage. Did other people come in and marry? Yes, they did, but on local people's terms. And their biology shaped by the African environment. No issue with that. That's evolutionary theory. That's science. It's not a problem. I don't have the problem. Other people have the problem.
Yeah.
I don't have the problem. I don't have the problem. Yeah. Now, when it comes to that mummy genome study, if you now let's add another layer to it. Well, Dr. Keita, but they had all these lineages that are Southwest Asian lineages. Yes, they did in the sample that they had. Now, I can be very expansive on this, but I'm not. If you read Middle Kingdom texts, as you can, and even some Old Kingdom texts, they were bringing women weavers, because these are primarily mitochondrial lineages. The three whole genomes they did would have been somebody would have been descending that, but they also had an E haplogroup in there, so that's African. Okay, some of the other lineages also, even the mitochondrial lineages, the M1A, although the M haplogroup is said to have arisen in Asia, some of its derivatives emerged where? In Africa. So even if in the background, so it's interesting how people manipulate and split up a lineage in their favor, or language will structure it in such a way that genes can flow through sequential populations, and get to a particular place, and they tie that whole string of populations together. Okay, the thing is that it doesn't mean that the ultimate place of origin of a lineage or a gene uh, isn't necessarily where a given individual got it. Okay, so let me give you. Let's do another thought experiment. The M89 Y chromosome, the lineage is defined by M89, are very common in Europe. In fact, they are the most common in Europe. So if we find somebody, an African American with an M89 lineage, well, they probably had a white grandfather, great grandfather. That's what we could say that. But what else can we say, Asar? What else can we say? See, now I'm interviewing you now. What else can we say?
um,
Remember that Chadic speakers have a high frequency of these M89 lineages that may have been on a back migration to Africa a long time ago, got into the Saharan, what I call the Saharan metapopulation, and these people got absorbed. Well, it may be that the African American with the M89 lineage, unless you got to do some other fancy tests with it, but if you just do a test for that lineage, maybe that M89 came from a Chadic speaker who wound up in the transatlantic slave trade. So it would not have come directly from Europe. Didn't come from a white granddaddy. It came from a 20,000-year-old lineage in Africa. They may have ultimately come back, but you see, once again, who defines the terms? Who defines the terms of the discourse? So back to the mummy genomes paper, incorrect to use just the Yoruba as a comparative sample. They are stereotyping. What are they doing? Once again, what lurks behind the idea of using the Yoruba? Well, of course, it was a convenient sample. It's in a lot of databases, so it's easy to use it. But the idea that you would accept using that and not talk about other African populations, what's behind that? A typological notion, a notion that, oh, all these sub-Saharans are the same. I can just use a Yoruba as opposed to using a Nubian, as opposed to using this one and that one. And some of these other people are going to have complex histories, but those are African histories. I don't care what's in the family tree. Okay? You got to expand the language and how you discuss these things, the discourse. Who sets the discourse? There's some other things wrong with that mummy genome study too, but we won't talk about that now. In terms of the whole notion of sampling, convenient sampling, and there's some other issues about proxy. You can talk about using things as proxies. They've used the sub-Saharan and as the Yoruba as a proxy, and the question is that even the right way to look at it? But they did get what they got. So if I had that same data, you should ask me, how would I write that story? And how I would write it, it would not be a banner, a headline, that a sensationalist headline about sub-Saharan influence in Egypt after the late period. It wouldn't be that. I would do a microbiological history of Abu Sir el-Malik at the time that it existed, and I would bring in the fact that they brought women weavers to a site 15 kilometers from there to do work. These people had children. Eventually, they get assimilated. You know this. And there, at one time too, John Baines, who was one of my supervisors at Oxford and the Oxford professor of Egyptology, John Baines talks about how the term Asiatic at one time was, guess what? A synonym for slave. Now, this is John Baines talking. This is not me. This is not a star. This is John Baines talking. It's very interesting. If you're going to have discuss these things, read widely. You'd be surprised at the kinds of information that allow you to simply be dismissive of the kinds of work that comes down that still gets published. There's some of the same old colonialist stuff, sometimes unconsciously. I'm not going to call the leader of that group that published that genomes paper a racist. I'm not going to call him that, Krauss. He was one of the authors of the Geneva Declaration. But that does not mean that he's necessarily conscious about how old ideas float around in discourse and still are connected to things. And it does not excuse them overgeneralizing or sensationalizing what they found. If that had been an article about a cure for this virus, that paper would have never been published, and they would have lost their credibility. Okay.
Indeed.
Straight up.
I have one last question, and then I'll take a few questions from the audience who was in the chat room at the current moment. So, of course, not in the archives. But just simply, I know in academia, it is primarily the journal articles that are valued, so to speak. But do you have, any books that you plan on writing, in the near future? And outside of that, for those who do read the journal articles, what kind of writings, what is your upcoming work?
Well, no, I wrote some conceptual chapters for a book on African genetics and health and disease. I wrote the introductory chapter that just came out in January.
Okay.
Cambridge University Press. The editors are Muntasa Ibrahim and Charles Rotimi. Okay. I have some others. I might write a very short book just on sort of a review of studies of biological affinity, ideas about that in the ancient Egyptians and craniometric studies, as opposed to other studies, non-metric studies, the different traits that can be used. I have a more basic science paper that I want to do, just using a large cranial set to look at some different types of variables. That's a pure anatomical correlation type study. And I have some other things I'm going to write about diversity, possible diversity in relationship to social complexity in Upper Egypt, as Upper and Lower Egypt come together. This debate about whether or not, Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt. That's the standard myth. That's the story we learn. Menes conquered Northern Egypt. So if he conquered, I mean, can we find destructive levels where he did it? Curiously enough, while people were saying that, in the biological literature, using a technique that's not really a good one, people were saying, "Oh no, the Upper Egyptians, as time goes on, were becoming more like the Lower Egyptians." Okay, so how do you reconcile it? So if the South conquered the North, why is the South becoming more like the North?
Yeah.
South. Okay, well, Christiana Kohler says doesn't accept a simple doesn't believe that there was this conquest theory. So she's against what Kaiser wrote and others have written, what the Egyptians wrote. I did a study that's also going to be published in one of the Origins of Egypt series, Origin 6. And what I did there was I showed basically that what Christiana Kohler said seems to make more sense about them coming together. Although I do also point out that I humanize and I historicize the diversity that you find in the Dynasty One graves. And what I think is going on, what I think has happened, is that the country has come together. And in Upper Egypt, you can find in the political context, you will find the diversity, and you find in the Dynasty One graves. If you look at even the Nakata material, you find a greater overlap with the North than the South. So I think that if you imagine a society growing together, now the political machinery, doesn't matter who says what, political machinery comes from the South. But whether that's a conquest in the traditional senses of, I'm not interested in that debate. I leave that to other people, But the biology, if there had been a simple conquest of the South, of the North by the South, then the later dynastic Northern crania as biological markers should be more like Southerners. They should be clustering with Southerners. Instead, they're sort of spread out. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the South did not swamp the North. The North came to the South probably because of opportunities or whatever, however you want to express that. The political emerging centers of social complexity were down there, and so you get overlap. And so I showed that in some data. I actually used somebody else's data for the most part. I used some of my own, but I actually reverse engineered somebody else's work. I don't know if they're going to like that or not, but I took their work and kind of rearranged it and showed how, well, look, if you look at this way, which is always good when you can use other people's work to make a
Yeah,
point. Yeah, yeah,
indeed.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Giving the opportunity for those who have a question in the chat, probably like 2 or 3
Sure.
questions, but I have one question. He asked this actually a long time ago, but I copied and pasted him and made sure that I preserved it so I can ask you. This question is coming from Sarah Jehuti, number 2. He asks, can you give a brief description of the following types of archaic humans? Homo erectus, Neanderthal, Denisovan, and if possible, can you provide a timeline for each?
Uh, those timelines vary, so I am not interested in misspeaking. So I'm not going to say. We can talk about that another time. Let me say that. But Homo erectus, uh, the question about the distinction is this: Denisovans are some sort of archaic sapiens, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Denisovans and Neanderthals would be as well. Their origin would have been in Africa. I hesitate to give a date. I was recently in Kenya, and the dates on a lot of things have been revised. And in fact, they even took down the dates off of a lot of the exhibits they had. So I am not I don't do paleoanthropology at that level. But what I can do is get back to you on that. And I think that some other people have pointed out. We did a small study I did with Jean-Paul Guerdin. We challenged the mummies genomes piece. You can find it online, and we're publishing that in another place as well, where we actually used the STR data, short tandem repeat data, that was published by Zink and Zahi Hawass in the Journal of the American Medical Society. And we used pop affiliator, and we were able to show, or it was shown, that, but this is unfortunate, they had a rough division: African, Eurasian, Asian, which is no more than what, Black, Caucasian, it's the same thing, just new language. But the Amarna mummies, on a probabilistic basis, identified more into the groups with the so-called sub-Saharan group. The original study on that by a company that's now defunct, the DNA Tribes group, they found an even greater thing. I wish that their algorithm is legitimate. Other people have looked at their algorithm; it was legitimate, and so they got a similar finding. Of course, this is all one family, so what can you say? There's another study that was done, just a technique study on histology, skin histology, that showed that some royal Theban mummies from further south, or elite, I shouldn't say royal, but upper class, that they had a lot of pigment in their skin, but it wasn't a big sample. I mean, I'm not even really interested in that. Like I said, the roots of ancient Egypt lie in the Saharo-Nilotic expanse. They lie in the primary pastoral community. This is the roots, and anything else are things that they grafted into that system on their own terms. In the same way that you may wear a pair of Gucci shoes, or Gucci doesn't make shoes, but anyway, wear a pair of whatever, or a tweed jacket, doesn't change who asarimhotep is. You can bring it into your own style. That gumbo soup or something that's made out of different elements that may be from this culture and that culture and other culture. Who put it together? Those African American and Afro Creole women in Louisiana. That's a part of what was done. Again, agency, where it was assembled, who put it together. We now even have some histochemical, biochemical evidence that maybe the wheat and barley, which did come from the Near East, was maybe being planted in the Sudan before it was in Egypt. But I say, so what? I mean, to that. What's more interesting to me is that the words for wheat and barley in ancient Egyptian, the words for the sheep and the goat, which came from the Near East and which were integrated into their subsistence, into their economic system. The names for these animals and these plants, as you know, are all Egyptian names, which suggests to me that they were experimenting with plants they just transferred to these foreign items that they borrowed, but they integrated them on their own terms. If you look at the article by Wilma Wetterstrom in 1993, in that book, Towns, Metals in Africa, something like that, she shows one of the best articles you're going to read. She shows how at the Fayum, how the wheat and the barley that came from the Middle East were integrated into a foraging strategy in the Fayum. There was no, quote, Neolithic revolution, which is what you would expect if you had mass migration from the Near East. You see what I mean? No, the people who were there, they took on these crops, they integrated them in, and over a period of time, these became predominant crops, but they had agency. They did these things. And I've already mentioned the Karunian skull to you and what have you. Again, you know, the emergence of the Saharo-Nilotic cultures of Egypt and Nubia, they have a shared entangled base, a shared entangled genealogy. There were some differences. There are many different types of Nubians. Nubians weren't all the same. Southerners, they weren't all the same. And I dare say that not all of the Egyptians were all the same. And I, which I know, and I can also say that the even that notion of the enemies of Egypt in some of the Egyptian texts, they talk about the enemies from the south. They're actually talking about other Egyptians. You know, they're not talking about that. You know, they're not talking about people from 10,000 miles away. Again, it's about reading deeply different things and thinking independently. Don't let yourself get straitjacketed into. I mean, sometimes the language that we inherit from disciplines straitjackets your conclusions. It leads you to having to discuss things in certain terms, when in fact, you know, those terms are problematic or don't give a complete picture. They're not truthful, or they're incomplete truths, or they get at one angle of something. You know, it's great to read old books, but when you read old books, you learn how to read them critically so you can get their data and not fall prey to their, you know, their problems. Unless your project is to write about their problems, and we need people to write about their problems, but in a very cool, calm way, critical way. We have persistent issues. I do want to say that right now we're fighting for our lives in terms of the coronavirus. So we need people out, community leaders and interested people doing whatever they can to encourage people to do things that allow them to stay safe and raise their families. You know, it doesn't matter, as I said before, whether whatever you believe about where it came from, how it got here, doesn't matter. It kills. So you want to protect yourself and protect the people that you love.
All righty. Well, this will be the last question.
Okay.
And this is coming from Radio One. He's asking the foundation of Egypt. Did it have any influence from the north? Then why the first? Okay, I'll just read it exactly how he wrote it. Ask him if the foundation of Egypt had any influence from the north. Then why the first pharaoh and the first dynasty all came from the south? I don't.
Yeah. Okay.
I hope
When you talk about any influence from the north, I'm trying to understand. Okay, there were two theories about this. There was an upper and a lower Egypt, sort of maybe a lower Egyptian kingdom at one time. Some people still believe this, and a simple model, Upper Egypt conquers Lower Egypt. Okay. There are other models that are more organic that say no, that there were two sides of the same culture on the ground. Some people would say that Christiana Kohler would say that there's been too much focus on funerary culture as opposed to the rest of all other culture. So in other words, if you and I focused on if we go back in a time machine in the 60s and we focused on, I don't know, some dance style or something, that will tell you something, but it may not tell you everything. Okay. So in some models, archaeologists have developed a theory that suggests that the two regions of Egypt grew together peacefully. Grew together over time, and that yes, the political machinery emerged in the south, and the certain aspects of the funerary customs. They say if you focus on the funerary culture, that's what you see changing. When they talk about Nakata 3 graves in the north, they're talking about a change in burial position and what have you. You could probably spend a lot of time writing about that. Now, when you look at everything that's been written, if you can read German and French, and I can't read German, I don't read French very well, you will see that so much paper has been spent, if you go back through 100 years, on different theories of invasions and this one, and Asiatics and this and that and the other. And there's a book that I think there's a paper that's going to come out soon about that by Christiana Kohler. She talks about these different theories. She puts them in a neat table. I think that what's important to understand is that ancient Egypt emerged from a Saharo-Nilotic base culturally, and the people of Saharo-Nilotic origins, and yes, people in the northeast quadrant of Africa at a macro level of evolution aren't going to necessarily be the same. Although they may have ties with other people in other parts of Africa, both North and infra-Saharan. But the cultural base rather, emerges there and in that area. And if you look up Wingrove's article entitled Convergence of the Neolithic, or Cultural Convergence of the Neolithic, 2015 in Antiquity, or 2014, I think was the year it was written. It does a good summary of that foundational base of Egypt in its African context.
All righty. I know I said that was the last one, but I want to get this one out. So this question is from Fitzroy Roberts. He's asking you, what are your thoughts on the Wan Muhajiag population from Libya being a Nilo-Saharan extract? I'm sorry?
Yeah, it's a very famous place because there was a child mummy found there, a child wrapped, like later mummification in Egypt. We've also found there's been an article written in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science about early mummification in pre-dynastic Egypt. So this mummification idea apparently is old, but this is So when they talk about, you cannot look at a set of bones and tell what language somebody is speaking. And even if you pull DNA out of it, I don't care who you are, you can't say definitively that DNA, just because you have a correlation today, it doesn't mean that the person with that DNA profile was speaking that language or belonged to that ethnic group if it's 5,000 years old. You simply cannot say that. That's bad science. Any more than where I'm from. I've told you I'm from South Carolina, but I could have been from Paraguay. I could have been from Oceania. Maybe even some parts of India, or from Saudi Arabia.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the arguments that I have with folks all the time. They insist on trying to connect genetics and language. And I'm like, there's no such thing as a language gene that will identify what language group or what language particular person spoke by just an analysis of their bones and their genes.
Yeah.
That you can't connect it in that way,
Yeah. Well,
especially in a historic nature. And
yeah,
so you can't. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I agree with you,
Yeah.
but let me tell you what's going on with that. The number one, that's an old 19th century project that some people have brought into the current time. Even some people that I know and have worked with have done stuff like that. But they'll say ancestry, human ancestry connects with language under the assumption that linguistic groups were like family groups or community groups. The problem with that is, just like you say, the ultimate origin of a language may be in some place where the original people that were there don't even have any obvious descendants today, and you don't know. So you can't do a simple correlation with what you have now. You can look at patterns and you can make comments, but you can't make definitive statements. You cannot, or absolute statements. You can't talk about not classifying a language family with another group based on the genetics of current day speakers, because you don't know who the people were a long time ago. So you use linguistic criteria, whatever those may be, and you have an opinion about that, but you use linguistic criteria to talk about linguistic classification of taxonomy. You use other types of criteria to talk about other kinds of, you know, grouping other kinds of things, the development of systematics of other kinds of things, be it biology or I don't know, books in the library. You use different techniques for different things. I mean, you use the appropriate. You may see some maps that are congruent that may or may not mean something. You need a lot more information, and all you can say is that, oh, this is congruent. To try to reverse engineer it and talk about absolute identity is very wrong. It's problematic.
Yeah, there's some people who think that you can have a bad methodology and get the correct answer when it comes to science. And I
Yeah.
always stress against that. If your methodology is bad, your conclusion is going to be wrong. Even if somebody says something similar and using more correct methods at the end, if your methodology is bad, your conclusion is going to be bad as well.
Or at least let's say your conclusion can't hold up or should not be regarded in the same light.
Exactly.
We can be polite. We have to understand that some of these areas of academic inquiry are not as amenable to the physics experiment. When you boil water, it boils. Okay, and and that doesn't matter where you are. If you get the water hot enough, it will boil. That's a physics and chemistry thing. That's not necessarily true. We're trying to understand uh, ethnohistory, archaeology, linguistics. I mean, there are things that aren't going to always neatly fit. I find that even in my own work. I say, wow, that's odd that this would do this way. Sometimes the oddity is the interesting thing because it reveals that some other process is going on. Well, a lot of times when it's odd, people will just dismiss it and say, oh, that's an outlier. We're not going to look at that. That may be the most interesting thing to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah, that might be the most interesting thing to look at. So if you go in your backyard and you find a 5-headed frog, you need to think about what that might mean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. I know you've been working long hours to converse with myself and my audience. Y'all have asked some good questions in the chat, and they're having their own discussion, which is normal for these live conversations in the chat. So I appreciate everyone who is listening live and who is engaging in the chat room. I just want to give you the floor, and so anything that you want to state in closing that you may not have touched on, or you just want us to walk away with before we end this conversation, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just simply want to say that let's remember that societies are complex. And complex societies, not all societies are complex, but even societies that some people would say are non-complex have always or often accepted outsiders. So, you have a place like Abu Sir Malik or some other town and some other place, and you have to read the history. And if you find out, oh well, oh, this was an old weaving center, or this was near a weaving center, and we know because we have records that say they brought women from the Levant, from Southwest Asia, to Egypt as weavers, which is something that we know that's documented, then you shouldn't be surprised. And you also all need to remember that you don't get great samples in any of this kind of work. So you can't make huge statements. And it's better to focus on the micro and give a history of the local, unless you have data from everywhere. You can talk about your local thing in a particular way, or local phenomena. So just remember, life is complex, life is complicated. Human society is complex and complicated. And people accept all kinds of people into their families, into their communities. They accept them, and they assimilate them sometimes biologically and culturally. I mentioned work that was done at Oxford a very long time ago, elegant genetic work on the parishes, the counties, if you will, around Oxford. And they basically, they studied marital distance, how far do people find to go to get a mate. And luckily they had a couple of 100 years of church records. So they could actually figure out who went from what village to what other village and all of that, and they could figure out all sorts of interesting things about family relationships and genetics and so forth. Well, I think it's kind of obvious that if you have population A and population B, right, that if they are exchanging mates, right, if they're marrying, going from village A to village B, that over time, genetically, two things happen. The villages become more alike, right, and they share more common ancestors, right? But is there another way you could get the same result? I mean, we'll leave out adaptive evolution. Yeah, there is. And this was discovered in Oxford. Imagine that people in village A and village B were marrying people from the quote outside world. Call it C, a larger universe. And so these were people were bringing their spouses back home. This also pushes A and B to be more similar, but not because of A and B direct exchange between each other, because of the exchange with a third party. They're becoming more similar. They may be hating each other, but they're becoming more alike due to their connection with a third party. And then you bring that, okay, so that's a very local example, but I will leave it to everyone here to think about other examples of where an external population has come into an area and basically given a common culture, maybe with some ancestry and some genes as well, to a wide region, a region that's not its own. And if you think about it hard enough, you can probably come up with different examples. So we'll call that just a mental exercise. There are other situations where, and it has ramifications. It may have ramifications today. Has ramifications today around the issue of identity. Very interesting. And thank you. And thank you for having me. And, it's always good to think about the world we live in and think about what we have to do going forward in many different ways, and to not simply accept it as it is. That you change. You don't have to accept the things you cannot change. You can change the things you cannot accept. at least within some reason. At least I think Angela Davis said that within some reason, or you want to work that way. But also you want to think about things that maybe other people haven't thought about.
Hmm.
You want to go beyond the language. This is not just simply a paradigm shift. I mean, people like to use that term, uh, which is also a good thing. This is simply saying, well, wait a minute, let me think about my real experience, or let me think about other ways that I could sort this information, and or another way I could look at this and understand the interconnections. That's what we need to do.
Hmm.
That's what we need to do. And other ways to conceptualize the reality. It doesn't mean that you're changing anything, but you're trying to get at a more accurate picture. We want to always strive for the truth and more accuracy.
Hmm. Indeed. Well, again, thank you, Professor Keita, for your valuable insights, and I hope everyone has been taking notes. I'm pretty sure they will rewatch this, so please uh, like the video, and share the video and have conversations about what you heard, and more importantly, since we are in this quarantine, take time to look at some of the articles and topics that he recommended, and read some of those things to kind of catch up, on some of the topics in which we addressed today. And so, if you have not subscribed to this channel, please, I, I ask that you subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. I'm getting back more and more into doing these types of interviews. I know I present my own information on my channel a lot, but I also like to uh, get perspectives and research from many scholars who a lot of us may not be familiar with. And so I appreciate you greatly, again, for taking the time out of your day to have this conversation. And I hope to have you on again sometime in the future. And with that said, I will see you all next time. Um, I think, and he's actually in the chat room right now. Dr. Kaikosa Kajangu. We'll be setting up something with him soon. Um, and we'll talk about his life journey and his studies. And we may discuss briefly his relationship with the now late Credu Mutwa out of South Africa, who just passed.
Mm.
And so, we have a lot coming down the pipeline. And so this is why I encourage everyone to subscribe, and especially to click the bell so that you get the notifications if you're not in my personal social media circles, that for when I advertise these things, that you at least get these notices when I create the event itself. So thanks, everyone. Y'all be safe at home, and even of those who are at work. So blessings to all of those who are essential workers that are keeping us uh, uh, alive, healthy, and afloat as the country goes through this bit of turmoil, so to speak. And I will talk to you all later. So peace and blessings to you all.